Sunday Assembly is part of a larger global community. There are over 40 Sunday Assemblies in the world. Every Sunday Assembly every year, except for this year, Sunday Assembly has had an international conference where everybody gets together. In 2017, the international conference, the fourth one for Sunday Assembly, was in San Diego. It was a wonderful event. Kaimipono Wenger was the speaker for that assembly, the assembly after the conference. He's associate professor at was an associate professor at Thomas Jefferson School of Law and director of the Center for Law and Social Justice before moving to Los Angeles. While at Thomas Jefferson, he taught business law topics as well as civil law and critical race theory. His research focused on a variety of civil rights topics and critical race theory, reparations and apology for slavery, and Jim Crow, and law and religion. He has presented and as an invited speaker for the Congressional Black Caucus in 2008, 2010, and 2014. He is now a senior staff attorney at the Inner City Law Center working on homeless prevention. This is the recording of the event from that day. As I mentioned, the sound, it might be a little bit different. I think when Sanderson Joan talks, one of the founders of Sunday Assembly, to introduce Kaimi, is quite loud. And Kaimi, it turned out, didn't turn on his microphone that day, and he was picked up by all the other mics in the room. So the sound is a little bit, might be a little more difficult to hear. So you may have to adjust your sound there. Definitely worth listening to.
All right, put your hands together for Kaimi Wenger.
All right, hi, good morning. So I'm Kaimi Wenger. I'm going to be talking about the question of racism and our unconscious biases. Click, there we go. I teach on the subject at Thomas Jefferson School of Law here in San Diego, and I've presented on it a little bit before. That's enough about me. Let's talk about why I'm not a racist and you're not a racist, and what does racism look like? So when we think about racism, we often have images in our head. Where should I be pointing? Oh, there we go. We have images in our head of people wearing bed sheets, waving burning crosses. That is definitely racism. We have other images in our head. This is a picture from violent police suppression of civil rights protesters. These are pictures that we have in our minds when we think, what does racism look like? There's a popular understanding. Racists are open about their racism. They walk around saying, I'm a racist. They walk around explicitly and unambiguously wearing their bed sheets, waving their burning crosses, and saying, I hate black people, I hate Latinos. Racism, of course, is evil and wrong. This is good. This is actually a significant progress, because when you go back a few decades, there was less of an understanding of this, but now in the popular consciousness, there is definitely a perception racism is evil and wrong. Racism is, wait, what? Oh yeah, racism is something that happened a long time ago. Racism is something that doesn't affect me because it happens a long time ago in places that I'm not. So what's the history of racism? Slavery. Slavery happened a long time ago, way back. What else? Jim Crow also happened a long time ago, mostly about drinking fountains. Yeah, we're going to be, by the way, in case it's not clear, we're going to be disputing some of these, but let's talk, I mean, when people talk about race, this is how we tend to think of it. Brown versus Board of Education in the United States, the Civil Rights Act, 1964, and racism is pretty much in the past now. We can stop talking about race now. My talk's done. Thank you very much. No, wait a minute. I don't see race. Oh, how many times do we hear people say that, right? I just, people are just people. I don't see, even though you're African American, even though you're Latino, I pretend like I don't see it. I notice it, and then I tell myself not to notice it, and so I'm noticing that I'm not noticing the noticing. And yeah, wait a minute, what is that? Of course, does racism exist today? We do typically give ourselves a little bit of possibility for that, right? These people, oh yeah, those crazy people, they're racist, and this guy, Mr. David Duke, and probably those nice folks in their highly decorated vehicle of Confederate flags. And when we do that, importantly, when we compartmentalize the idea of racism in that way, it sets up a counter-narrative. Who is not racist? Who is not racist? Me, obviously. Oh wait, this is the royal me, right? All of us, we're telling ourselves, who's not racist? Well, me, obviously. Who else? My friends. They're not racist. My family, except for that one crazy uncle, and he doesn't count. This is a nice story that we tell ourselves. It's a comfortable story that we tell ourselves. Why am I not racist? Because racism is conscious. Racism consists of walking around and thinking, how can I be a horrible person today? How can I march around in a bedsheet today? Racists are bad people, and I'm not a bad person, and I'm not consciously thinking about horrible things, and therefore, I'm not racist, right? This is a thought process. It's okay to say we've all sort of gone through this thought process. Does this sound familiar? Let's puncture this, and we'll start with Charles Lawrence. Charles Lawrence is a scholar of race who wrote this about 30 years ago in his article about unconscious racism, groundbreaking work. So Charles Lawrence, African-American professor of law, writing on race, writes the line, "We are all racists. Most of us are unaware of our racism." Wow, wait, even me? We are all racists. Let's talk about unconscious. Wait, how do I become a racist even if I'm not aware of it? Because I imbibe cultural images. We all do this, right? You turn on the television, you look on the internet, you walk down the street, we live in a stew of images. We tell each other these stories, narratives about how the world works. And these narratives are infected with stereotypes. These narratives are infected with repeated ways that our brains are programmed to see people in particular categories. And when we do that, it creates expectations about how society operates. We've been talking about stories. We've been talking about the stories that we tell ourselves. Some of the stories that we tell ourselves are infected with biases, are infected with stereotypes, are infected with negative perceptions, even if we don't realize this. And this creates, well, let's start with a riddle. This is an old riddle, and it's problematic in a lot of ways. It's actually deeply heteronormative in disturbing ways, but it's a really good illustration of ways that these narratives work. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a riddle about the surgeon, and it's an old riddle. The riddle goes like this, that a man and his son are in a car accident, and the man is killed, and the son is rushed to the hospital and put on the operating table, and the surgeon walks in and says, "Wait, I can't operate, this is my son." And how does that, what's the answer to the riddle? And a surprising number of people are unable to figure out that the answer is that the surgeon is the boy's mother in the riddle. And of course, we can step back and say that it's problematic to assume that all particular couples consist of a male-identified and female-identified individual and so on. But stepping back and looking at the question, why is it that people are unable to think about the fact that maybe the surgeon is the boy's mom rather than the boy's dad? It's because we have an image in our head. When we think surgeon, we've seen 10,000 images on television, and these images tell us that a surgeon is a male person. And because of that, when we hear the boy's father has been killed, we say, wait a minute, that's a riddle, that doesn't work. Not only that, so as I'm looking up this image for this talk, I Google female surgeon, right? And then this is what comes up when I Google female surgeon. Notice who's not there. She's not there. Yeah, when I Google female surgeon, there's an implied assumption there as well, that I'm talking about a white individual rather than an African-American, Latino, Asian, person of Middle Eastern descent. Yeah, we have these stereotypes built into our minds. And when we think, what does a surgeon look like? What does a lawyer look like? What does an accountant look like? They tend to have a particular face. They tend to have a particular set of identifying characteristics. And because of that, we are all infected with implicit biases. Let's talk about some of the really cool experimental results that have been going on with this. Some of you may have heard about these. You can take a test where you are shown a picture of African-American face or white face and then words like good or bad. And you're supposed to click on which side it is, and it turns out that it takes you a lot longer to click. Okay, if there's an African-American face paired with the word good, it might take you half a second to click. Whereas if there's an African-American face paired with the word bad, it might only take you 0.1 of a second to click there. That is, our minds they tend to go in certain directions. Let's talk about what these implicit biases are. By the way, Project Implicit, you should go take the test. These biases show up across multiple categories. My area of expertise is race, but they show up across gender categories, they show up across sexual orientation, they show up across a variety of categories. That is when we pair faces with characteristics, people are very, very quick to associate. Black is bad, black is dangerous, because we've been affected by these implicit biases. What's the cause here? Let's talk about our brains. When you see 10,000 images, we build these super highways in our brains between certain concepts. So the neural pathway in our brains, and it's been built this way, it's been programmed this way by all the years that we've been living, has a super highway between the words black and the word bad or dangerous. Whereas when we see the word black and the word smart or the, white or dangerous, we've got this meandering country road there. It takes our neurons longer to process these because they're not linked together. We've built this idea in our brains, these narratives and these couplings of ideas, and they are affected and infected with racial bias. And I should step back to point out, this is how brains operate in general, right? That is, our brains are meant to focus on things, we can categorize things. I don't have to say, what is that piece of furniture there? Oh, it looks like I might be able to sit on it. My brain just says, chair, sit on it. So this is part of the normal process of thinking about and categorizing ideas, but in the process, we've become affected by the biases built into society. So how does this show up? It shows up in several ways. One of the ways that it shows up is what we call privilege. If you want to start a fight on the internet, talk about privilege. And of course, as soon as you say the word privilege on the internet, someone says, wait, I don't own a yacht. Well, I don't own a yacht, therefore I have no privilege. No, let's talk about what privilege really is. So privilege is a lack of structural disadvantages that affect another group. So when I was teaching my class on critical race theory a few years ago, I was talking about privilege and talking about both racial privilege and gender privilege, and one of my students, a male student of color, said, I don't have privilege. He said, I come from a poor background, and therefore because of that, I'm a person of color, I don't have privilege, even though I'm male, I don't have that. And so it's always a challenge when you're talking to the class and students. I mean, I don't want to devalue his experience, but at the same time, I do want to point out problems with that. And so I just said, hoping that it would work, I polled the class and I said, all right, how many of us have ever asked somebody to walk them out to their car in a parking lot? And every woman in the class raised her hand and none of the men did. And my student thought about it for a second. He's like, okay, I guess there are pieces of my life where I am not affected by structural disadvantages that affect another group. There are pieces of my life that have privilege, and I don't even see it when it happens. Privilege, okay, the set of people, to speak broadly, the set of people who get most annoyed when you talk about privilege tend to be men. And so as a result, one of my favorite things to talk about with privilege is the idea of privilege as home court advantage. Because people will say, you know what, I don't have a butler who brings me my, peeled cucumbers or whatever else, therefore I don't have privilege. It changes when you bring in the sports analogy. And so let's talk about what home court advantage is, or home field advantage in the sports setting. The home team has certain structural advantages, privileges you might call them, built in. If I'm on the home team and we're playing basketball or football, the other football, then I don't have to get on an airplane and fly across the country. I don't have to be jet lagged. I'm sleeping in my own bed. I'm not sleeping in a hotel. I know the field. I know who the fans are. The fans are cheering for me. They are booing for the other person. I'm not on a different time zone. All of these things add up. And so when you talk about the odds makers, you go to Las Vegas and they say, yeah, this team has a 3-point advantage because they are on their home field. They have a 5-point advantage here because they are on their home field. This is when we talk about racial privilege, gender privilege, sexual orientation privilege, this is the type of structural advantage that we're talking about. And importantly, it doesn't mean several things. It doesn't mean that the home team is bad. It doesn't mean that the home team doesn't work hard. It doesn't mean that they win all of the games. They don't. It doesn't mean that somebody on the visiting team can't sort of sometimes take energy from the fact that they're an underdog and use that. You see people say, I really like to stick it to the other team on their own field. But at the end of the day, when you add up the factors on both sides of the equation, there's a definite advantage to being the home team. And it shows up in hundreds of games, thousands of games, and we call it home court or home field advantage. This is when we talk about racial privilege. This is what we're talking about. We're not saying you, John individual, Jane individual, are bad. We are saying there are certain structural disadvantages that you don't have to worry about. Let's talk about other aspects, especially ideas relating to intersectionality. Intersectionality is the idea that when people are at the intersection of multiple marginalized categories, there are special types of disadvantage that may affect them. So my friend Kimberly Crenshaw, writing on this, writes that about 25 years ago, there's a case where the company will not hire African American women. They will hire black men, they will hire white women, they will not hire black women. And the court, looking at it, says, well, they hire black men, so they're not race discriminating. They hire black women, so they're not gender discriminating. Therefore, no discrimination. Real case. This is DeGraff and Reed. It's about 20 years old now, 25 years old. So Kim Crenshaw, writing on this, points out that people at the intersection of multiple marginal categories can face unique kinds of discrimination and subordination. These days, of course, obviously we can apply it beyond just race and gender. You can say somebody who's at the intersection of a race plus sexual orientation or other sorts of, when you start combining categories, sometimes you end up with people who face unique and types of discrimination and subordinations that are not captured by single axis analysis. That is, if you just look at it as a race issue or just look at it as a gender issue, you miss the types of special discrimination that the African American women might face. So yeah, when we talk about race, when we talk about gender and how to combat these implicit biases, we definitely need to bring into the equation intersectionality. Let's, in our last short while, talk about the banality of racial bias. And of course, this is riffing on a theme that Hannah Arendt writes when she writes about Nazi prison guards. That there was this perception in the late 1940s, early 1950s, until she writes her book, basically, that Nazi prison guards were these horrible, horrible people who said, how can I go torture others today? And in fact, this is the disturbing part, they were mostly just individuals who thought of themselves as going and doing their job. This is, as Hannah Arendt writes, the banality of evil. That when you plug yourself into a system and you say, well, it's just my job to go kill people at a concentration camp, then you end up with people who aren't necessarily moral monsters doing horrible, horrible things because that's what the structure tells them to do. Are all racist people horrible monsters? If so, racism can't exist unless we're surrounded by supervillains. We're not necessarily surrounded by supervillains, but racism does exist because these biases create structures that reinforce racism without the need for particular monstrous people. Not to say that monstrous people don't exist, but there's a whole lot of just average individuals who go through life infected with racial bias, who don't think about it, and who make these decisions on a day-to-day basis, and who perpetuate these structures of racism. What are some of the effects? Let's talk, let's go back. Forward, backward. All right. Some of the effects, mass incarceration, when you look at the statistics, a massive number of African-American individuals incarcerated in the United States. I'm less familiar with the statistics in Great Britain and other countries, but to my understanding they're very similar, that you have these huge racial biases. You have a justice system which in many cases puts young African-American men in prison with something like 5 minutes of grand jury deliberation and then a coercive structure to force them to take a plea. In a famous article about it, one of the authors writes that African-American men are put in prison in less time than it takes to brew a cup of coffee. There are 1 million African-American men in prison in the United States right now. How do we get this? Because we have these ideas about what wrongdoers look like, and boy, we put them in prison quickly. Economic inequality, I'm going to move quickly because of time. Like, come on, thing. Violence. So one of the critiques of implicit bias is, but how many decisions get made in a quarter of a second anyway? The decision on whether or not to shoot an unarmed young man. That decision gets made in a quarter of a second. That decision gets made infected by the process that somebody has seen tens of thousands of images, and so when they're asked to make that decision in the quarter of a second, they kill the young man. Yes, all houses matter. Backlash. Right now we're facing a world of resentment and anger against anti-racist norms. Why are black people complaining? Racism is over. Have we heard this? Yeah, the redeployment of colorblindness by conservatives, the idea that any remedial measures to try to help African Americans are bad because some sort of colorblindness, which is typically used to fight against any affirmative action, is, yeah, these days the Reconstruction Amendments mostly get used to strike down programs to help black kids get into college. I mean, it's ridiculous. Skipping forward, because we're just about out of... we'll skip, that's Justice Scalia, we'll skip him. We don't need to talk about him. The political impact, we don't talk about specific politicians, but there are perhaps people who are using these backlashes against anti-racist norms as part of their political program. Can you, oh yeah. Political tropes, myths of a time when life was so much better, and so on. And finally, let's talk about how do we recognize and address our own bias. Don't ask, is Bob a racist? You'll get a knee-jerk response. No, Bob's a good person, he can't be racist. Do ask, how could racial biases be affecting his decisions or thoughts here? Don't ask, am I a racist? Your knee-jerk defensive response will be, no, of course I'm not. Do ask, how could racial biases be affecting my decisions and thought process here? Move it out of the cerebellum into the frontal lobes, move it into the thought process, as one of my colleagues writes, make it salient. Think about, why do I think of this individual in this particular way? And when we do that, that's how we can combat our racial biases. Who's a racist? We're all racists, but with the right set of tools, we can push back against them. And thank you.